Também é carioca, diretora. Você ainda está na Argentina agora.
Okay, should we start?
Yeah, okay. You want to say anything?
No.
No?
Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming to the university during reading week, and for being here. It's an immense pleasure to have Felipe Tuxá back in Manchester. Felipe was here first time in 2018 as part of the project Racism and Anti-Racism in Brazil, the case of indigenous peoples. At the time, Felipe was a PhD student at Universidade de Brasília. Now, Felipe is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Universidade Federal da Bahia, Federal University of Bahia. And Felipe is and still is, the first indigenous lecturer to be hired at the University Federal da Bahia, which is a big thing. He's also an activist, very, very integrated to the indigenous movement in Brazil in general, and also a researcher of APOIME, the Association of Northeastern Indigenous People, and mapping indigenous lands. Yeah, hello. So, Felipe, it's a pleasure to have you here. So,
What should I sit here? Yeah, the people in the Zoom room, they're going to see this camera.
yeah. If you need help doing slides or anything, let me know.
Ligando sala de espera do Zoom. A Érica tentou entrar e não está na sala de espera. Since I think like there's a waiting room.
I know.
So
Ignacio's managing it.
Oh, Ignacio's managing. Oh, brilliant.
Oh, okay.
I felt like it's in like Erica. Yeah.
Okay.
I
Thank you.
hope he's managing it.
Okay.
Thank you, Lucia, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here, to be back in Manchester. And thank you, Professor Peter Wade as well. We actually met on 5 years ago when I was here in October. It was also in October 5 years ago, before the pandemic, and so much has changed since then. I've been here in the UK now for 2 weeks. This is my last stop, and we call this a mission of work from the university. So I've been presenting my previous research and current one in King's College London, then I went to East Anglia in Norwich, Oxford, and now here. I'm returning to Brazil tomorrow.
Wow.
It's been very interesting to hear, to have the feedbacks on my work and also to share it here. And this research this presentation that I brought here is my current one, which is a return to what I did as when I was taking my master's degree, which was a research that was in my own community, the Tuxá community located in the northeast of Bahia. And as Lucia said, now I'm teaching in Bahia, Salvador, the main city of the state. And I was the first indigenous professor to be approved to teach there, which is interesting because Bahia is the first state to be colonized by Portugal. So it's the oldest place where Portuguese arrived back then. And until then, there was no indigenous professor, which is something very critical that's beginning to change because of the affirmative actions that began in 2012 with a law that was created by Lula, president. So now we're as we speak, we are discussing very interesting things in Brazil, such as the creation of the first indigenous university. It's something that current president wants to build like real quick. So we're working on that. We're creating a project for this university. So everything is very new, I guess, when it comes to indigenous presence. And this work is about, this is a contribution to something that has been very fashionable within anthropology in Brazil, which is ethnographies about the strategies of indigenous community to occupy land that was stolen from us. We have two main categories for them. That's how the indigenous people label the movements. One of them is retomada, which is retaking, we could translate as retaking land. And a more current one is autodemarcação, which is self-demarcation of lands. Those two movements are happening within the country, and different ethnic groups are doing their movement to occupy and claim lands, specifically after the federal constitution of 88. Prior to 88, there was a process of identification of indigenous land, but it was in 88 that the state published a guarantee in two chapters of the constitutions regarding indigenous rights, that it was a state obligation to demarcate indigenous land. So since 88, the state changed two main ideas in the indigenous policies, ethnic policy of the country. The main one was since 88, the state acknowledged the presence of indigenous people as groups that are not going to disappear. This is a major shift in the integration policy. So from 88 on, indigenous people were entitled to the right to exist as indigenous and to remain indigenous and to live accordingly their customs, beliefs, and tradition. Another major shift was the guarantee of indigenous lands, and that it was the state's obligation to demarcate the indigenous land. So after 88, since the state began this process of demarcating, most of the time it takes long years to do this process. It was said that within 5 years, so probably 93, all the lands would be demarcated. But as we speak, there are many ongoing process of demarcation, and it never happens. So the retomadas and the autodemarcação, to some extent, are a response to the morosity and the inability of the state to actually to fulfill this the demarcation within its obligation. So this is a map that I brought about, so you can see exactly where I'm speaking of. It's the east coast of the countries where colonization began, and right now it's the second region with the largest population of indigenous groups. The north region, where the Amazon is located, is the one with where most of the indigenous groups are, and then the northeast region is the second one. And Bahia is the second state with the largest population within the country. Amazonas in the first place, Bahia the second state. This is something that is just recently published from the new census that was published in 2022. I have these two main ideas that I'm following to make sense of the self-demarcation of the Tuxá. The first one is from Marcel Mo's The Gift. He says, to refuse to give, to fail to invite, just as to refuse to accept, is tantamount to declaring war. It is the reject of the bond of alliance and commonality. And the second one was an aunt told me in 2016 when I was doing my master's. That's what I say. I don't want a land with evils. I want a land without evils. Do you know what I'm saying? Just like the widow's island, the Ilha da Viúva was. A Ilha da Viúva was ours at the time we were respected. I brought these two epigraphs because I think two are better than one. The first, by most, needs no introduction. It talks about gift giving and ideals of sociality through the observance of giving, receiving, and giving back. The second is from my aunt, Auxiliadora Tuxá, a 72 years old indigenous woman who is my aunt and also my father's sister. This is her. She's a traditional leader, very important in our ritual practices and our ceremonies. I heard her words in 2016 when I was conducting research in the memories of the elderly about the process of the displacement of the Tuxá, and about her future expectations regarding the fulfillment of the agreements that were signed between the São Francisco Hydroelectric Company, SHESF, and the community. Austriadora was 36 years old and had 4 children when the Itaparica Hydroelectric Plant was inaugurated in '88. The dam formed a lake, a reservoir of more than 800 square kilometers, and flooded 4 municipalities in the region: Itacuruba, Rodelas, Petrolândia, and Barra do Tarraxio. Rodelas is where we were located. The town was called Rodelas, and it was completely flooded because of this hydroelectric and the dam. Among the 10,400 families that were displaced by the project were 200 Tuxá families, residents of Rodelas on the borders between Bahia and Pernambuco in the median São Francisco River. Most of what was the Tuxá territory at the time was flooded because of this dam. And we were resettled in a place they called Nova Rodelas, New Rodelas. So the company built a temporary camp for us to stay until we had received the compensation for land that we were displaced because of the flooding. Despite countless strategies to achieve justice based on diffuse administrative categories such as compensation, mitigation, affect people, and agreement, the community now, as we speak, we are still very dissatisfied. We have so much dissatisfaction with how the negotiations went, and obviously for the fact that we never received what was promised to us by the company. Mainly because the territory that we used to live was taken away from us because of the flooding of the dam, and they said in 6 months you're going to get new land for you to live on, and until this day we never got it back. This is the dam, Itaparica Dam. This is a photo that I took. It's huge, and it's more than 5. There are more than 5 of those in the area. This is after this one in '88. They still built another one called Xingó in '93. So when in the '80s, the beginning of the '80s, my community heard the rumors about the construction of a dam that would flood their lands, we had already been displaced by different fronts of colonization expansion. The name of more than the 30 islands that were part of a traditional territory remain vivid in our memories. However, when the company began to discuss with us about what was going to happen to them, what was going to happen to us, and about the dam that was going to be built, we only had 1 island left that was used by us. So in the ancestral memory, people could name more than 30 islands that was the traditional territory. With many fronts of colonization, we were systematically having those lands stolen, and by the use of violence, we had to abandon such islands. So in '88, we only had 1, which was the one that's in the text in the beginning, was called the Widow Island. That was the last one that we had. It was the largest of the islands, but it's interesting to see how the displacement comes way back in the past. I talked to a shaman called Armando, a spiritual leader, about it in 2015. He just recently passed. And he mentioned about his grandfather telling him about the spirit. He said, the loss of our land, I don't think this is here, no. This is a photograph taken by Hohenthal in '52 of women Tuxá with traditional clothes made of caroá. And there are also cachimbo in one of the hands, and the maracá, which is a percussion instrument. So going back to the shaman, he told, remembering what his grandfather had told him, the loss of our land goes way back in time. In the past, we had 30 islands, all belonging to the Indians. They invaded. It wasn't the Indians who sold it. That's what the people often say. Indigenous was selling their lands for nothing, but that's not what happened. They invaded, and if you were brave, and if you tried to hold the possession, you probably get killed. They killed indigenous right here in this village. I remember it so well. I was about 8 years old. A man, a powerful farmer called Anibo arrived with a lot of cattle and released them in the islands. When the cattle arrived in the islands, they just hit the maniocs we were planting, and the maniocs were already that big. It was almost time to collect them. We also planted sugarcane that was already big, but the cattle destroyed everything. They left nothing. Who was going to complain? Only if they wanted to die. Anibo and his men were very strong, and if you complain, you would die. Then he took the whole island, and they were taking over islands, one island after the other. They came from, we don't know where they came from, but they stayed here, and they took the islands for those who were occupying them. Since the indigenous didn't want to die, they didn't have any weapons to fight with, they could only accept it. They had no weapons except for bows and clubs. I think this is a photograph taken within the islands with the traditional, because at that time, prior to the hydroelectric, we used to live in what we call a dupla morada regime. So we would stay the days in the islands and return at night to the shore where the houses were actually built, where people used to sleep. According to the story, there were various strategies for robbery, from open violence and threats to use of animals to destroy and ravage the indigenous gardens. With the exception of the Widow's Island, no other island had been maintained in the 80s. It was during that time that the company officials approached the community with the news of an imminent hydroelectric dam. When I asked people during my research about what they thought when they heard it, the most common answer was that they heard the rumors for a long time, but nobody believed such thing could actually happen. They doubt that a project of this size could exist, something that could stop the river flowing and create a lake of such proportions as to cause such intense flooding. They also mentioned an occasion when helicopters flew over the island and landed within it. I was born in the 90s, so I'm part of a generation that never stepped a foot in the islands. We only heard about it. And in 2015, yeah, when I began my master's degree in social anthropology at the University of Brasilia, I wanted to research about this process of displacement. We heard about it all the time, every day, and I want to understand how this is possible. I mean, you have your place, you live in your traditional area, a state company say you have to leave because the progress of the nation is coming and you need energy, it's going to benefit you all. In 6 months, you're going to get land back. And then 30 years later, nope, we never saw anything. And I mean, it just didn't cause I wanted to understand what exactly happened. It was when I did the math and I realized that 2018, it would be 30 years of waiting, that I said, okay, I have to look to take this opportunity to research this period. This is also a picture taken by an anthropologist that was there in the 80s before the displacement. She was very interested in children, so she has those pictures of children living within the river and playing. They're very beautiful. I think her name is Angela Nunes. This is where we are now. This is the resettlement. So this is the main square of the community. I live nearby in a house that direction. That's where my parents' place is located. And the resettlement followed the pattern that they used to resettle everyone in the area. So there was no idea that it was an indigenous community, so we have to do a different kind of resettlement with respecting architecture pattern or something of the sort. So this is Aldeia Tuxá in the new Rodelas. My dissertation that I wrote after this and I defended in 2016 was about memory, about how people rebuild their lives and rearticulate themselves in a context with when so many changes were happening, a context very different from the one they grew up, about the process of seeing the whole world they knew swallowed up by the waters of a river that has been in the past our dearest friend. It was about memories and counter-narrative, or what is called progress, a narrative of the common good of the nation. In a sense, I was very interested in what Felipe Tuxá, an indigenous scholar from the US, said, research focused on damage. So my research was about the damage that was caused. Its title is Quando a Terra Sair, the Indigenous Tuxá and the Itaparica Dam, Memories of Displacement, Memories of Resistance. Quando a Terra Sair is an expression that people used to say all the time when I was a kid. Quando a Terra Sair means something like when the land comes, or when the land comes out. I remember everything that I used to talk to my father, say, when are we going to do that? Can we see an uncle that lives elsewhere? And they will always say, when the land arrives, when the land comes, we can do that. Because in the 90s, everyone was very full of weight anticipating the fulfillment of the agreements. So they say it was a condition to the present, the idea that land would be giving back to us. So we hear that all the time, and that's the title of the work. It became a condition for the tomorrow. The present was never truly lived within those 30 years, because the future was also compromised by the idea of the land that would come. Shasfi told us that in 6 months, we would get new land to live on, and it never happened. Time passed and life unfolded in this way, between waiting and the present that is urgent in an everyday life. So people had this idea that the land would come anytime and you couldn't make plans until it happened. But at the same time, there were urgencies of the everyday life in this new place that needed to be organized. Children were being born. We had to plan. There was no land for people to grow manioc and all that. So that was the tone of the work. I wanted to kind of make sure that you understand that it was very focused on damage and the idea of justice and how we were deprived from proper rights because of this mega project. So the whole thing changed in 2010. It began to change in 2010 when the Tuxá community. Oh, this is me and my cousin. I forgot this one. This is the new generation in the river. Right? It's not. You can see the branches coming out of the water because this is where this didn't have water in the area. The river level was very reduced, so it's full of decomposition material below in the underwater now. So these are a couple of them that you can see. I already said that. So this is the first retomada that we did in 2010. I didn't really mention that in the work. I was so much focused in the damage caused by the dam that I didn't mention this occupation because it only lasts 5 months. I remember going there. This is a picture that I took. I was 20. There are two Malocas there. And we entered that area called Dzorabábé and we took it. This occupation only lasts 5 months. It didn't last longer than that. I would say because of lack of the organization of the community itself, as if we weren't ready to do such thing. Dzorabábé, this place, is an area of dunes in the riverside area. So it's white sand and dunes that change overnight. So if you go there one day, on the other day, everything is different because the dunes keep changing because of the wind. We consider this area to be sacred. so because of since the sand keep changing, every day that you go there, you find archaeological remaining. We call it surface material of the old ancestors that used to live in that area. We find remainings of ancestral ceramic funerary urns. We call this a cemetery. As a kid, we would go there to eventually on the weekends. And I remember to be told, if you find anything, do not touch it. Call someone, call an older person, and we see how the idea that you simply can touch those things because you need an older. I remember being told that a lot when I was a kid. So this is the area that we began an occupation. We call it retomada at the time. I have a timeline so you to understand what happened afterwards here. In 2010, we did this first retomada. That was the word used, an occupation. Because of that, there was a process on the justice that said the Tuxá people needed to be compensated because of what we did to them. And we need to demarcate a land for them in the area. In 2014, it was the first time a federal court demanded the Indigenous Affairs Foundation to create a work group to identify and demarcate this area called Dzorabábé. Nothing happened after that. They even though there was a decision towards it. In 2017, on June, I had already finished and defended my dissertation. Another regional federal court said that they sentenced the union and the FUNAI to comply with the other decisions from 2014 and said, if you don't do that, you're going to have to pay a fee. You have to identify and demarcate the Tuxá land in the Dzorabábé. So after that, after this judge said that, less than 2 months after that, the community began the self-demarcation because the government was saying, you have to demarcate, you have to identify, and it was almost like the community said, we're going to do it ourselves. Since the state's not doing it, we are going to begin the self-demarcation of this territory. So this is the area that we did the self-demarcation. It's called Dzorabábé. The ancestral land of the Tuxá community. And this moment here in 2017 was a turning point in the history that I was telling you about, how we were waiting for the state to fulfill its agreement with us. I didn't see it coming when I was writing my master's. And eventually, when I heard the news, I was in Brasilia, and people called me, we just did a self-demarcation, the community is organized, we entered the area, we're going to build fences ourselves, it's happening. And I was so frustrated because I had just defended my work, and I didn't mention, I was like, we are waiting, the community needs justice, and I was talking about the memories, all those narratives about loss and grief, and how nostalgic we were about the past. It was a turning point in a century-long history of dispossession of the Tuxá community of Rodelas, when in August 31, in 2017, to enter, reclaim, and occupy an area we consider sacred, known as Dzorabábé, Grandmother Village. So we have the Mother Village, which is where we are located now, and this is called the Grandmother one, because it's the ancestor one. It is located 11 kilometers from that resettlement that I showed you. Dzorabábé is an area of low, dry vegetation known as Caatinga and is located on the banks of the São Francisco River. In the opposite side, where the old village that is now underwater was flooded in the past, and is therefore sacred and ancestral ground. The Dzorabábé territory was self-demarcated by the community itself, which, after long decades of waiting for the state, decided to deal with the land problem ourselves. The self-demarcation action was followed by local reactions of non-Indigenous people, obviously. So the brother of the mayor went to Facebook and said, those Indigenous people are thieves, they want to create confusion within the area. We lived so well, everyone together, and there is no problem. I mean, why are they doing this? And because of that, the Council of Indigenous of the Tuxá Indigenous Group published a note called the caravelas came, but they passed. We Tuxá people consider this area to be sacred, and it belongs to us. It was something like, with the note had this tone, which is interesting because the note said, the manifesto, with the aim of speeding up the implementation of the judge sentence, the Tuxá people from a mother village organized themselves and decided to make the high demarcation, bringing together all the Tuxá from Rodelas to a strategic area that was chosen because it is located in front of the islands that were flooded in the past. And this area is right really close to an island where an old chapel was built by the Indigenous, because the Jesuit made us build a chapel, and it's now underwater. So it was strategically chosen because of the closeness to what is now underwater, and because of the archaeological findings that we do there. This area symbolized the reunion with the past, with our ancestry, with the sacred that is inherited to the origin of the Tuxá. So we cannot accept that it is not ours, and that non-Indigenous people would consider this area to be merely a productive land. What is interesting about this part is the idea that we are helping the state to do its work when we do that. So that's why we say, I mean, since the state is taking forever to do that, we're going to help the state and we're going to do it ourselves. I was in Brazil when I heard it, and I remember I was taking top courses in anthropology, such as Anthropology of Land with Professor Marcela Coelho. And I didn't know, I had no idea this was going to happen. So it was the judges' ruling that created the fact that made the whole thing move, I guess. I was obviously frustrated that I didn't mention it within my dissertation. So in 2018, I returned to my area as a professor in a state local university to teach in a course that has only professors, Indigenous professors. It trains Indigenous to be professors in their local schools. So I was a professor there. I returned in 2018 to teach. And some of my relatives was studying and taking the courses I was given. That's when a cacique, a chief called Antonia, came to me one day after. This is the demarcation area. It looks like a turtle, and this head here is turned to the islands where we were removed from. So as you see, it's a very dry area. We just built the fences in this area here to symbolize the act of demarcation, because we don't identify the area. We need a proper work task to identify the area that is the governmental duty to create the group, coordinated by an anthropologist. We have more houses now. We have a communal house here that's not that. I mean, that was a communal house, but it was small. It's really larger now, and it's round. This is also there. This is me and my brother in the lake. This is Antonia. So when I began to teach in the local university, Antonia, who is a cacique, came to me and she said, Felipe, I've been planning to write about the river. I want to write about our relationship with the river and about the self-demarcation. Would you be willing to write about it with me? And that was what I wanted to do, since I felt like this part was left out of my previous work. And I said, okay, let's do this. We wrote a paper together that was called I Saw Two Small Fishes, the Tuxá people's reunion with their encanted waters. The Tuxá have united themselves and reorganized themselves to request this area, which symbolizes a reunion with the past, with our ancestry, and with the sacred and the mysteries and knowledge of the São Francisco River. We call it Opará River, a river considered essential to our people. Dzorabábé is the traditional ancestral of the Tuxá people. It is the place of the first area that our ancestors lived. It is the cradle of the origin of the Tuxá people, the place where the ancestral cemeteries are located, and is therefore sacred land. That's part of what we wrote. Because it is sacred, it is a territory where indigenous people receive spiritual strength, and it is also a rich diversity and medicinal plants site where we collect them to use in our ceremonies. The bonds that indigenous people establish with the ancient knowledge that exists in their territory is crucial for living. This is not different for us. We have a coexistence relationship with this territory. Consider our cosmology, sociocultural and spiritual, and that's where our strength to go on is within that land, living in that land, dreaming in that land. And we wrote about it. We said, living in the Dzorabábé territory, take us back to our encounter with the sacred waters of the São Francisco River, where we can go back to being canoe indigenous people, and that waters of Opará has always been part of our history. That was the case in the past, when immemorial flooding caused us to leave an area. Because there is a myth in our creation from ancient times that mentions a flooding already. So there is like an idea that way back in the past, we used to live in an area and we have to move because of a flooding. So to some part, the idea that a flooding is part of our history is also interesting to understand how the whole narrative of the hydroelectric was understood by us. So we have to leave that area, and now we are going back to the area. We're going back to the river so we can be who we are meant to be, and we can find physical and spiritual nourishment to our people and to the young generation that need to be living within the river. Even with all the difficulties and emptiness caused by living far from the river, my generation is a generation completely disconnected from it. I guess that when we went to the first generation on the 90s, experienced parents trying to come up with how to explain the fact that we see ourselves as canoe indigenous people who live mostly from fishing, and then in a context where nobody did that anymore. We didn't have canoes anymore. Nobody fished. Nobody had, because the whole idea, the whole thing had changed, and they had to tell us why this happened. So we collect testimonies from the new generation that is now living within this area and experience a different connection with the river. They say, this is Gabriele who said, the waters of the São Francisco River are very important to us, both in our daily lives and within our traditional science. We are a people who grew in the banks of the river with its calm water full of mystery. Their waters give us strength and they are sacred to us. They are bathing our people since the beginning. She's like 15. For the Tuxá people, water is a natural resource, a source of survival and the production of sustainability. More than that, the water of the São Francisco River is home to the spiritual forces that make up our cosmovision. Water is the source of a millenary wisdom, and the aggressions that took place in the river, what they caused the river to suffer, are a process that also affect us and all the indigenous people who live in the area. Because this area called Medium São Francisco River, Medium River, is filled with indigenous groups. It's not only the Tuxá. We have Tumbalalá, Trucá, Pancararu, all indigenous that live in this area that were known because of so many waterfalls that were there. And as you saw, it's a very dry area. So the margins of the river were the fertile ones. So historically speaking, that's why there are so many archaeological remaining, because the islands were the most disputed areas and also the river banks. Today, with the self-demarcation, the young people, the young generation can reconnect themselves with the river, and this invigorate their strength as they see, live, and feel the beauty of the river and the ancestor in the ancestral territory. which their parents told them about many times in the stories of the elderly. And then this is a quote because it's interesting how we wrote it. We said, how wonderful it is to see the children playing in the river, learning to swim without fear, learning to value and to live their beliefs, and the youth become stronger every day in the science and in the forces of the water. By living in the territory, in their home next to the São Francisco River, they can experience those stories they only heard about. In this way, we are also guardians of the São Francisco River. And to maintain living accordingly to what we believe it is to live well. So it was very interesting after we published that paper, because Antonia came to me eventually and she said, you have no idea what happened. I was presenting our paper. I saw two small fishes, the re-encounter of the Tuxá with the sacred water. And someone came to me and said, this text is so romantic. It's so, I don't really remember the word. And Antonia passed recently as well. She died from breast cancer. It was very sad. And I remember she telling me about that. Someone said it was a romantic text. And within academia, to say something is romantic, it can be put in that dichotomy between what is rational and what is passional, emotion, or militancy from one side, political, and from the other side, serious and technical texts. So she was unsure about what romantic means. And I was thinking that when I was presenting, I remember that when I presented my previous work, which was focused on damage and grief and loss, someone said something the opposite. Someone told me that someone overheard a guy in the audience saying, did you see Felipe Tuxá lecture? You can see there's so much anger in what he says. And it was interesting because I was talking about loss, grief, and injustice. I was definitely angered when I was speaking about that word. So things changed, and we were now talking about images of young people living in the river. And it was romantic because I guess for the first time we were experiencing some romanticism in our lives. We were dreaming about future generations, and we are seeing the beauty of, it was all new. And we wrote that paper in that moment. So I guess it was romantic. But what I was thinking of when I decided to bring this is because this EV text that I mentioned is a text that says that it's time that narratives about indigenous people that used to be focused on damage shifts its focus to desire, to dreaming, and to that. I guess that's what we did. When I think of my previous work, it was very focused on damage, and this work now with Antonia was focused on desire and how we want to see ourselves, how we want to live. But when we do that, we are labeled as romantic. It's interesting to see what categories indigenous production is often being framed within hegemonic discourse in academia. So I was thinking about I'm going to get into the end of it. When I was thinking, what is this that is a self-demarcation, trying to contribute with the literature on land claiming in indigenous Brazil, because something that always struck me is that when I was listening to the narrative and testimonies about what happened, what the Chesf caused us, and Chesf was a state-owned company. It was not a private company. It was owned by the state. The word that people use to describe what Chess did to us was betrayal. They say, we were betrayed by the state. Chess betrayed us. And I wanted to understand, why do they use that word? Why don't they say we were robbed, for example? They can say we were robbed by the state, but they use the word betrayal to describe the situation. For many years, my research interests within my own community were focusing in analyzing the construction of narrative about this process of displacement and resettlement. In particular, I was focused in regimes of memory, how people narrated the past and organized their present, full of problems because of the Chesf Hydroelectric. And it was interesting because this was the title of the text. And the same woman also said this to me once. She said, that was before the self-demarcation, 2015. She said, I don't have the strength to do this anymore. It is not that I don't have the strength. The problem is all the disappointment. The disappointment counts so much, all the struggle we did, and nothing ever happens. We get tired. We were betrayed. We were betrayed. Because the idea of betrayal always encompasses a mutual expectation in the first place. If someone robbed you in the street, you won't say you were betrayed. You say, I was robbed. But if you say betrayal, there is a previous relationship idea happening in that relationship. So I wanted to, so what was the expectation they had? And something interesting is that on the narrative, people say, what could we do? That land was important to the future of the nation. It was the progress arriving. We couldn't do anything. So there was a narrative that we were giving our lands away because it was for the greater good. But as a counterpart, the state would compensate us, giving us other lands for us to live. That was the agreement that was made. And the idea of betrayal comes because state in Brazil within indigenous people was in past seen as because indigenous people in Brazil was located within the civil code in a category of relative incapable people. So we couldn't respond to ourselves. The state were responsible to us. And the state used a narrative of protection as we know what's best for you. So that's why I am your guard. Yeah, I'm the tutor.
Guardian, yeah.
Yeah, I'm your guardian. So until 88, we were under the guardianship of the state. And people grow up listening this idea that the state knew what was best. But the state who knew what was best and was supposed to protect us was the very one who took away our land and never gave us back. So I try to understand this idea of betrayal as well as part of my current research to understand what is the expectation and how understanding what is expected from the state is important to understand the self-demarcation process in itself, because demarcation is a legal category. Retomada, the word retomada, retake, isn't a legal category. It's an idea that you go to the dictionary and you say, what is to retake something? And retake needs a complementary word, because you can retake a land, you can retake your language, which means to work on revitalization of a language. So what are you going to retake? I'm going to retake my land back. But demarcation is a legal category within the administrative work of the state. Whenever you say demarcation, you bring the state to the table. That doesn't happen when you say retake land. When you say retake, you need further information. What are you retaking? Was there a farm there? Who lived in the area? But when you say self-demarcation, you bring the state to the discussion. You cannot, because the state is the one who has the monopoly to demarcate land. This is an administrative action. But the contradiction is that at the same time that you recognize a legal procedure, when you use the word demarcation, you said, but we are going to do it ourselves. So you put the self in the beginning and you say self-demarcation. Because in the very idea of the combining those two words is a contradiction. At the same time that you acknowledge states, acknowledge the process created by the state to identify indigenous land, you say that he's not the only one who can do it. So it's very interesting. That's when I begin to think as refusal, because as I said, we were only waiting for the land, for the state to do its work. But at some point, the community refused to wait and said, we are not going to wait anymore. We're going to do this anymore. We are going to do this ourselves. And I go back to Mose because refusing, saying no, is often taken as the denial of the bond, of the relationship. is the rupture of the relation. And in this context, it was by saying no that this amazing thing happened. It was by denying, waiting, that we come up with this incredible project of self-demarcation. So I was considering to think as refusal as the potential place that was central to the Tuxá to get back the control of our lives and the process in our own hands. And that's what I wanted to present to you. I guess there's no more. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Yeah, we have some time for questions now. I have, I don't know if you turn it to the audience, the camera, or leave it. I don't know. I have questions myself, but I would prefer other people to ask. Angela has questions.
Do you prefer that I ask the question in Portuguese or in English? English,
Well,
right?
if I can answer in
Is
Portuguese.
anybody who doesn't speak Portuguese? I think there are some people who
I
don't
think I
speak
can only think in English because you spoke in English.
Okay.
So I'll try the English because
Okay.
it's a lot of expressions and words and
Yeah,
concepts, right?
Yeah, lost. Yeah.
So fascinating. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I was in the late 1980s as a master student at the Museu Nacional working with the Chucuru
Okay.
when they were talking about ethnogenesis and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's another history. Very much history. So when you're talking about these words that I collected here, the anger, romanticism, betrayal, and not robbery. I want to start with the romanticism. It seems to me that rather than being romantic and romanticizing, it's about regaining hope, right? Regaining a certain kind of hope that has gone down, has been shattered by the disappointments, the constant disappointments with this relationship that is supposed to be reciprocal between the state and its people, right? Especially the kind of people that the state is supposed to guard, supposed to be a guardian, tutelagem, right? So then it seems to me to be about being able to finally regain the hope in the future, in the present, etc. However, it's a regaining of something that is a mixture between the relationship with the state, a very contentious relationship with the state, and autonomy. Finally coming out of that tutelage and bringing its own self-autonomy process, right? And the rupture that you talk about, what was it? Was it rupture?
Yeah.
With the state, right? It seems to me that it had been the state rompendo, breaking. It was the state that was breaking that reciprocity, that supposed reciprocal relationship. It got broken over and over again. And maybe the process here might be, I'm going to challenge you on this. The process here might be that the Tuxá are not breaking, they are re-entering it in their own terms. Right, you are now forced to re-enter this promised reciprocal relationship that you, the state, said that this was going to be about. This was our business, and you broke it. So now here, I'm forcing you to acknowledge the relationship, to acknowledge the recognition, the humanity, the care, right? Because it's about expectation of care.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not refusal from the Tuxá, it's actually the opposite.
Yeah. Well, something that you finished.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I presented this paper in Mexico, and there was a indigenous intellectual from the US, and she also said maybe this is not refusal, this is an act of sovereignty. And because they use this category sovereignty up there in the north, but we don't use it in Brazil. It's like banished from political indigenous discourse. I would definitely say it's an act of autonomy. I think this word, what I didn't use that word, because, but I said in the end that it's like we are taking as hedges of our lives like, back to
Reins,
ourselves.
yeah.
Yeah,
Taking the
I
reins.
definitely there is this idea. I mean, we are in control now, but with a relationship that we can't simply avoid, we can't simply break.
Yeah.
I mean, during the pandemic, there was a local judge who said that put on a eviction order. But he couldn't do that because he was local judge, and indigenous affairs are ruled by federal court only. So he didn't know that, and he was a friend of a friend who had a land in the area, and he said, you have to leave. And the minute the eviction order came, everybody was like, oh, we're going to have to leave again. They are going to put down all the houses. People were ready to leave and abandon the area. I mean, so the power of the state is still there, right? But something else that I didn't mention is the temporal aspect of what I'm saying. I mean, there are multiple temporalities when it comes to why 30 years later. But I definitely think that this could be considered an attempt to change the terms of the relationship, but not to deny the relationship in itself. But what I was thinking about refusal is, I guess, the idea that the self-demarcation is born out of an act of denial. That's what I think of. I mean, it was first necessary to come up with a refusal to wait. We're not waiting anymore. What we're going to do, we're going to do it ourselves. So I think that the focus is on how denying can create such new things, such as a project as a self demarcation. But yeah, I really enjoyed your question because it makes me think about that every relation has different expectations, and the terms of it is sometimes known by only one of the parts. Sometimes you don't know what exactly are the terms of that relationship when you enter that, specifically when you are in a very asymmetrical relationship, such as indigenous and state relationship, I guess.
Thank you. Leticia?
Thank you so much, Felipe. It was really, really interesting. I was like fascinated all the time. Your narrative is beautiful as well. The way you construct your talk. I have one genuine question. It's about your paper. It's published. I can assess that the paper you wrote with Antonia.
Yeah,
I
this
saw
one
two
is.
small fishes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and also if you're playing with the Dennis Townsend book called
I saw-
a fish saw me
Yeah.
was like the opposite way you construct I saw two small fishes and the fish look at me or saw me. And the other thing is like, I'm trying to think with you about temporality and how in your childhood you were living, thinking about the future, waiting this relationship happens actually, you were waiting for that happens, but always not living the present. And when you finally goes there, leave the present and write something about that, not being angry in this moment. They just say, oh, it's too romantic. And how you see that happens in your writing and this change in your angry for more
Yeah,
Yeah,
see,
oh,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's it.
Can I just go in, because my question was going to be similar to your second question. I have in the rainforest literatures book, I wrote about the ease with which the adjective romantic is applied to indigenous people. At any time you say anything positive
Yeah.
about an indigenous group or indigenous people, say it's romantic, right? And you also mentioned something very important, that anytime you talk about justice, it becomes anger.
Angry.
And my question is to do with, in your PhD and the work you came to do later, you talk about denial, and you talk about racism against indigenous people operating in a way of negating
Mhm.
the very right to existence, and going from somebody who is an indigenous person who is driving a car or wearing sneakers or whatever is not indigenous anymore, but somebody who is living, naked in the Amazon is savage, is not, so you cannot exist in one way or another. And it seems to me that this going from romantic to violent is the same thing, it's the same strategy
Mhm.
of denial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. People keep asking me about, this paper is published in a book about Tuxá. It's only chapters about the community and our indigenous authors and non-indigenous. And some people have asked me about if the title was inspired by Stanislav's book. And the thing is that Antonia was the one who came up with the title. And I never asked her, and I mean, now she's gone, I couldn't ask her about it. But I didn't feel like I needed to ask, because when we came to the material, when we gathered the material, the text is filled with literal images of young children swimming in the river. So when we got to the title, I always thought it was a reference to ourselves and the young generation living in the waters of the São Francisco River. The chance of she have been familiarized with the Stanislav's book, I think it's a very reduced, but we never know. I mean, I never felt like asking her. I thought it was part of the beauty of the thing to leave it open as to the reader. Because since we don't address the title in the text, people ask, you what is this title about? And I always say that, and the idea was the children in the river. The temporality, I guess growing up, the feeling that was more present was the idea that how is this possible? I mean, how is it possible that we had land and then we don't have land anymore? And it was the state who did it, and nobody. And also, we were very angry because it didn't make civil opinion angry as well. Because I remember seeing Belo Monte in Amazonia, and everyone spoke about it. And I think, but this happened within my community, and it's 30 years ago. And nobody seemed to care. I guess that was a bit of what was happening. At some point, the community set a plan of sending the youngest one to the university so we could be the ones to do this, the luta, indigenous anthropologists, indigenous lawyers. And that was when the future began to take shape again. Then the idea of romantic, I definitely see it as part of the dichotomy on political and technical and militancy and academic, romantic and rational. I guess that's where they want to place us. But when you think about romantic and anger so you take it to a different position, I guess, because in my PhD, as Lucia said, I discussed about racism and lethality. And the idea that there is no place for indigenous people to exist within an old colony. We are like aliens to the original plan. There was supposed to be no indigenous now as we speak. if the project was successful,
Yeah.
there was nowhere to be indigenous. We should be mixed Brazilians,
All Brazilians.
all Brazilians, yeah. And so I remember, for example, the universitary indigenous in Brasilia, when we made a project to record everyone speaking about their experience within the university. So Brazil has more than 300 indigenous different ethnic groups, and each group has a different way of seeing things and living. And we had like 80 indigenous students from different regions of the country to say what the experience was in the university. So you have indigenous that had Portuguese as second language. You have so barely spoke Portuguese. We had indigenous that only spoke Portuguese. We had indigenous with dark skin, light skin, curly hair, and all of them were in, some of them would perfectly fit the stereotype, and some of them would be very different from the stereotype. But all of them would say narratives when someone doubts about their indigeneity. So I remember this woman, she is completely stereotyped, has the features traditionally associated with indigenous. She doesn't speak Portuguese properly as well. And she was taking a plane to home after a semester. She was in the plane, and this area that they were going is an area filled with indigenous group. So she was talking with like 8 years old non-indigenous children that looked at her, and she asked them, "Are you afraid of going there? I mean, afraid of flying?" And the kids say, "No, I'm really happy to go there, but I'm just a bit afraid because there are so many indigenous people there." And so the woman, this was interaction between a non-indigenous and a woman who looked 100% indigenous. But to that children, maybe the fact that she was wearing pants and was in the plane and had a mobile phone, she didn't identify that woman as an indigenous because of that. And the indigenous who don't speak Portuguese are often referred to in the campus as Bolivian and Peruvian indigenous. So nobody is indigenous, nobody can claim to be indigenous. It's a place of a non-existent, I guess. And that has, and so when we, and also, I guess the narrative that people are more used to is if you go to speak about culture, but not land claims, not future planning, I guess, then, because it's romantic. The only thing that people accept us to speak about is about when it fits within the cultural diversity paradigm. A paradigm that celebrates diversity, you can talk about it, but history and land claiming are not accepted, I guess.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm a linguist and I'm interested in the consequence of the displacement of the different, like, I don't know, maybe your community, maybe other different communities. What I was wondering is whether the displacement into, like, what did you call them, like camps or the places where they basically, like, you know,
Okay,
the new, like,
the new
location.
village, yeah.
Yeah, the new village.
Yeah.
So what happens there? Is it that, you know, it's like every community has its own village and then continue to speak and transmit the language? Is it that there are some communities that want in contact with each other but that live in close proximity, and then we have the result of language contact with maybe lack of transmission? What's the linguistic situation there?
In the Northeast, where colonization is very, very old, it goes back to the second half of the 7th century. We have communities that were that were able to maintain the language more alive as the Funio. But most of the indigenous communities of this area speak Portuguese daily and have the traditional language, the native language, used mainly in ritual and ceremonial areas and practices. So chanting and rituals, are where the language is remain being used on a daily basis. But most of the communication is done in Portuguese. And right now we have a discussion, it's the decade of the indigenous language. And one of the discussions that we are making was to consider indigenous Portuguese a language in itself, because the Portuguese spoken by indigenous groups are often very different from other Portuguese. So we're speaking Portuguese in plural when we consider indigenous territory. But right now, many indigenous communities are also doing very interesting retomadas of the language. So they are retaking the language and teaching youth generation again, try to revitalize the language. So we have a very different scenario when it comes to indigenous language in the country, because the country is really large. So we have language that are spoken by 5 persons, because the group only has five persons. We have languages that are well alive and people use it daily. And we have also languages that are, I guess, people are, its use is being reduced. So that's what the decade of the language we're working on creating ways to value. So that we're working on the project of the Indigenous University, the first Indigenous university of the country. And one of the main principles is that every Indigenous student is able to go to the university and use its language, his or her language, in all the process of the university itself. Because what happened in those areas is that language was forbidden for many years, and by the church and then by the government itself, and people could be punished by using the language. So sometimes we just go to elderly who can speak and they refuse to speak because of the trauma and all the non-possibility of doing that. Thank you for your question.
Laura?
Oh, hi, Felipe.
Hi.
I'm Laura. I have a question thinking about words and everything you're talking about, semantics as well. But it's so good to hear your update about, because I'm not in academia, but I'm Brazilian, and I remember I'm older than you. And when you said about retaking and demarcation, or retomada e demarcação, because I remember when I was young, you used to have the word posse, possession, and to have and repossession the lands. So I'm just wondering, so these words, so there is still weight, or is it power from the words? Because now you're taking, for me, it's like I'm learning demarcation. But I used to listen to when I was young as retomada and posse. So I still, what about posse? Because it's still valid, so.
Well, the thing is that, I don't know if you remember, but every time, I think someone has raised their hand here. There was in
Viviane,
whenever indigenous people came in the news, was like an indigenous group has invaded a farm. The word used was invasion. And then you didn't get any detail of what's happening. It was just, it has invaded, they have invaded, they have invaded. And now we use occupy, obviously. We try to use or retake the land, we retook the land. But posse is still a legal category within the legal system in Brazil. What we discuss about posse is that private ownership of land is different from indigenous possession of land. There are many jurists working on that, because this takes us directly to the Marco Temporal thesis that is discussing possession now as we speak. The confusion, obviously, between what kind of possession are we speaking always works in favors of those who are not indigenous. So people don't want to learn the difference between the modalities of possession, because the Brazilian legal system acknowledged the possession right of indigenous as prior to the establishment of the state in itself. So it's a different kind of possession that goes way back the establishment of the state itself.
You can take that question
Yeah.
up there. Can you read it on the screen?
Okay. Felipe, I see your point, but wouldn't cultural diversity serve as an effective entry point for discussions about land, history, and related topics. What is your opinion about the new ideas of culture that painters, writers from different groups are bringing to Brazilian culture? What I think is that what I was saying, Viviane, is that there are a few spaces within Brazilian imaginary where indigenous people are able to exist. And the idea of discussions on cultural diversity is one of them. I'm thinking about how it celebrates its cultural diversity and heritage, but at the same time, indigenous people live in in camps on the railways sides. And also as indigenous leaders are being criminalized, also as when you think that indigenous suicide rates are 3 times higher than non-indigenous population. So when you think about there is this book I like very much from an indigenous in front of America, which is called Indians in Unexpected Places. So when you think about what are the expected places that indigenous are to be, you create areas where where indigenous people can be predictable, and that's the whole point of colonization. It wants to create it wants to make the land predictable, to know exactly where you find each group, and you reserve certain areas for them to exist. That's what happens when an indigenous person leaves the territory. Because if your territory is demarcated, you are supposed to be there. Don't go to the city, don't go elsewhere. That's when you became a threat to the system, because you don't know where to expect. And what to expect to be predictable is what the state wants from us. And sometimes enunciating from the cultural diversity area or discourse is the place that some parts of society has allowed us to exist, to celebrate cultural diversity. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear about it, but it's just where we can be predictable is when within those kind of speeches, where this can be celebrated. But I do think that even there are many that can be potential things that comes from this place, obviously, because we are very hard to be domesticated and to be framed within what non-indigenous expect of us.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the painters that are now entering museums and important exhibitions will talk about the fact that they were rejected before, and that they couldn't actually occupy spaces, and literature even more in that sense as well.
Yeah, and they question this very much idea. They do.
All the time.
But I guess it's not where they come from, it's where they're going.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
they have to enter from somewhere. As well, we're speaking about the indigenous literature being labeled as children books.
Mhm.
I mean, most of the indigenous, the first indigenous to publish books were in this area of literature, that books were aimed to children. But when they were questioned, they said it was where we could be suitable, where people could accept us to write to in that perspective.
It's again the relationship with the state or the Brazilian society,
Yeah.
Okay, I think
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about time that has come up several times, because I mean, typically, you know, one of the ways in which indigenous people featured temporarily was in the past, right? You're always consigned to the past, you belong to the past. If you want to be part of the future, you've got to mix and assimilate and so on. And then my attention was caught by that idea of quando a terra sai, which is placing indigenous people sort of in the conditional, in a present that's conditional on a future which never arrives, as an impossible future. So you're sort of stuck in the present now. So you're in the present, but you're stuck there, you can't get out. And then that refusal is about refusing to wait anymore.
Yeah.
And then confining people into this predictable space. Predictability is also about controlling time, so you know what's going to happen in the future. And romanticism, sort of like, you know, when people are positive about the future, then, oh, that's just romantic. That's again consigning them to the past. So it's not really a question, it's just a kind of comment about the manipulation of certain temporalities, so that there's almost no way out for
Yeah.
Indigenous people except to refuse the temporalities that are being imposed on them in some way.
Yeah, very good, yeah.
Yeah, always thought about it because in my work, someone also said there is generational aspects because you have people who lived in the islands and who were old when they were removed. You have my generation who was born right away after, and you have a new generation already who experienced life differently because the world was a, because you see, when I was reading literature on indigenous land claims, I didn't find many things on ethnology that could help me regarding indigenous people, because our situation was very particular because the lands that we were claiming was underwater. We couldn't go back there to retake the islands. And I remember that something that was very useful to me was the literature on refugee camps of Pakistan, because the anthropologist was writing that when you go to a camp, first you live in very improvised houses, and then you stay like 10 years there, and then you begin to invest money on the house. So you build walls, you get something, you get a door, and these are signs that the person is not planning to go back anymore. And that happened in the camp because my generation was, quando a terra sair, we were still thinking about it and we were planning our lives accordingly. If the picture that I took was already like 20 years away. So the houses were not the same houses that we were given. People put money into it. They do different, they differentiate the house from one another. And that meant that people were what's going to do now when they give the land? If they give the land far away, are we going to abandon this? Because the new generation had created bond with that land. There is a traditionality in that land now, the resettlement. So I think that this is important because what is to plan and try to make plans in this situation where you just don't know what is going to happen, I guess. It's very, very, very tricky. Yeah.
Uma
very-
condição de permanente, de permanência, né?
Yeah, I definitely saw that as we were growing up. I mean, the future was suspended. That's the point. The future was suspended because of the state. And I guess that's what was called romantic, because I mean, people just wanted to leave and it's so great when you go back there, and we have this place to go, we have these houses there, and everything is very different now because of it. Yeah.
Okay, I think we stop here, and thank you very much, Felipe, and thank you, everybody. Are we going somewhere afterwards?
There we go to the sandbar.
We're going to Sandbar, so if anybody wants to go to
Yeah.
Sandbar, we'll be there. Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to those who attended online.
Yes,
You're there, you're still
Yes.
here.
yeah.
How many have we got online?
The word not is
No,
on.
the word is
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
No,
That's it.
What's
that? What's that?
Sim, vamos.
Yeah.